£55 billion of tax rises and spending cuts announced in the autumn statement. But the Chancellor says he's asking more from those who have more. Jeremy Hunt's announcements mean millions of people will start paying more tax. There's also an increase in the windfall tax on oil companies.
Our plan also leads to a shallower downturn, lower energy bills, higher growth, and a stronger NHS and education system.
Spending on public services will rise more slowly than planned. Labour says people aren't better off after today's announcements.
Growth dismal, investment down, wages squeezed, public services crumbling. And what does the Chancellor have to offer today? More of the same.
But pensions and benefits will rise in line with inflation. We'll be out across the UK asking people what they make of the measures. We'll have the latest on all of them and look at what it all means for you. Also in today's other news. In Ukraine, the bodies of more than 60 people with signs of torture have been found in the newly liberated region of Kherson. A court in the Netherlands is delivering a verdict on 4 men accused of bringing down a passenger plane over Ukraine in 2014. And in the cricket, world champions England are hammered by Australia in the first of the one-day internationals.
And stay with us here on the BBC News Channel for continuing coverage and analysis from our team of correspondents in the UK and around the world.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the BBC News at 1. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has laid out plans for the country's finances in the autumn statement. Announcing £55 billion of tax rises and spending cuts, he pledged to rebuild the economy. Nearly 2 months after his predecessor's mini-budget triggered turmoil on the markets and pushed up interest rates. And it comes as the government's independent economic forecaster says the country is already in recession. Well, the Chancellor announced that more people will pay the top rate of income tax of 45p in a pound. That's anyone who earns £125,000 a year or more. There is also a freeze in income tax thresholds, which means millions of more people will start to pay more tax. And that's because as wages rise, the proportion of earnings that people pay tax on will increase. However, pensions and benefits will rise from April, in line with September's inflation rate of 10.1%. For businesses, oil and gas companies will face a bigger windfall tax of 35%. That's up from 25%. That will start in the new year through till March 2028. Spending on public services will rise more slowly than planned, except for health and education. Help for energy bills will be extended, but it'll be less generous. Millions of households will see their energy bills go up by hundreds of pounds a year from April. And electric vehicles will no longer be exempt from vehicle excise duty starting in April 2025. The Chancellor told the Commons that his plans will tackle the cost of living crisis, rebuild the economy and protect vulnerable people. Labour said the country's economic challenges have been the result of government mistakes, not just global factors. Our first report this lunchtime is from our political correspondent, Damian Grammaticus.
After the last Tory budget brought chaos, what's in that little blue book is meant to stabilise things. The photos released by his team are meant to be reassuring. This is a Chancellor who needs to win back trust in the financial markets and in his own party's ability to manage the economy.
Is austerity coming back?
The Cabinet know that, and it must all be done in the face of soaring inflation, looming recession, stretched government budgets.
Who's responsible for this mess, Mr. Hunt?
The answer is, of course, in part, his own predecessor. Jeremy Hunt says his task now is to tackle inflation, believing that is the biggest threat we face.
High inflation is the enemy of stability. It means higher mortgage rates, more expensive food and fuel bills, businesses failing and unemployment rising. It erodes savings, causes industrial unrest and cuts funding for public services. It hurts the poorest the most and eats away at the trust upon which a strong society is built.
So he said just over half the measures he's planning will be tax increases. Every earner will be affected. The thresholds at which tax is paid frozen for 5 years. But he highlighted that unlike Liz Truss's budget, taxes are not being cut for the richest.
Asking more from those who have more means that the first difficult decision I take on tax is to reduce the threshold at which the 45p rate becomes payable from £150,000 to £125,140. Those earning £150,000 or more will pay just over £1,200 more in tax every year.
And something called for by the opposition, there'll be more windfall taxes on energy firms.
I've decided that from January the 1st until March 28, we will increase the energy profits levy from 25 to 35%. The structure of our energy market also creates windfall profits for low-carbon electricity generation. So from January the 1st, we've decided to introduce a new temporary 45% levy on electricity generators. Together, these measures raise £14 billion next year.
The other half of his plan is for spending restraint, discipline and efficiency, he called it. But there will be more than £2 billion a year put into schools and money for the NHS too.
I will increase the NHS budget in each of the next 2 years by £3.3 billion. The Chief Executive of the NHS, Amanda Pritchard, has said that this should provide sufficient funding for the NHS to fulfil its key priorities. She said it shows the government is serious about its commitment to prioritise our NHS. £3.3 billion for the NHS, £4.7 billion for social care, a record £8 billion package for our health and care system. That is a Conservative government putting the NHS first.
Mr Hunt said pensions and benefits will go up in line with inflation. So he said this was a plan to help protect the vulnerable and return to growth. Labour's Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves wasn't impressed.
All the country got today was an invoice for the economic carnage that this government has created. Never again can the Conservatives be seen as the party of economic competence.
The combination of tax rises and the hit from inflation means people will face real falls in their disposable income.
In the last hour, the Conservatives have picked the pockets of purses and wallets of the entire country as the Chancellor has deployed a raft of stealth taxes, taking billions of pounds from ordinary working people. A Conservative double whammy that sees frozen tax thresholds and double-digit inflation erode the real value of people's wages.
It all means a tough winter and a hard couple of years are coming. Damien Grammaticus, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, we'll talk more about the numbers shortly. First, though, let's get political reaction from our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. What sense are you getting there of all those announcements, what people are saying about it, Nick?
Jane, we've been on a bit of a roller coaster, haven't we, when it comes to government economic policy, from the tax cuts of 8 weeks ago when Liz Truss was Prime Minister to tax increases today under the new Chancellor and the new Prime Minister. A lot of what we've seen today is about trying to level with the public. I think that there are difficult periods ahead. We've had the announcements from the Chancellor that thresholds on tax will be frozen, which means as our wages go up, people will be paying more tax. We've also seen big increases in the windfall tax, something that Liz Truss said she was ideologically opposed to. So this is a very different approach from a new government. On spending, although there aren't cuts in the next couple of years, there is going to be a squeeze, and that squeeze gets even more significant in the next after 2 years. Ironically, when there might be a general election, no doubt some of this has been kicked down the road. But I suspect a lot of what happens at the end of today will be about how this feels for people's budgets, how it feels for people at home. There are going to be higher energy bills. Yes, there will still be support from the government, but you can expect energy bills to go up. These documents tell us a lot about what it means for real household incomes too. And it's quite striking that disposable income, real household income, is actually going to go down for a lot of people and will take a few years to rebound. So this is going to be a difficult squeeze for a lot of people's pockets, and that is a difficult political sell.
Nick, thank you. Nick Eardley there. Well, our economics correspondent Andy Verity has been looking through the details of all those announcements made in the Commons. He's with me for what it all means. Andy.
Thanks very much, Jane. Well, the culprit behind all of this, a reminder of that soaring inflation caused mostly by much higher energy prices. Here's what that's expected to do in the coming months. From its peak now, above 11%, it will stay in double digits through the winter before dropping quite sharply over 6 months to almost no inflation, see at the bottom right there, in 3 years' time. Because for now we're spending so much on bills, there's less money to be spent on everything else, so we're likely to produce fewer goods and services. In other words, the economy shrinks. The official forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility, the bit missing from Kwasi Kwarteng's mini-budget, suggests the economy's grown by 4.2% this year, but it's now in recession and will shrink by 1.4% next year. That means less tax rolling in from VAT and income tax, and the government will spend more in interest on its debt because interest rates are rising, and also more on benefits as the recession takes hold and unemployment goes up. Now, it's worth remembering Rishi Sunak borrowed £318 billion 2 years ago to cope with the pandemic, but it was manageable, partly because the Bank of England was buying the bonds government issues when it borrows money. Now, last year, borrowing dropped by more than half. No austerity was needed, lots more tax money coming in as the economy bounced back. But this year, it's expected to rise again as we enter recession to £177 billion before it starts to drop back again.
The Chancellor's growth expectations and borrowing plans do look credible. They're the stability that people are looking for. But you have to remember that all forward-looking forecasts, as we've seen today, are based on assumptions. And those assumptions may be very different from reality. And there's a real incentive for Chancellors to be positive when making their assumptions about the future.
Now, Jeremy Hunt's chosen a fiscal target of getting debt falling as a share of the economy 5 years from now. That's not an economic necessity, but a political choice. On reasonable forecasts about growth and interest rates, to hit that target by then, he needs £55 billion of spending cuts or tax rises, but the timing is crucial. If you raise taxes or cut spending too soon, it can make the recession deeper, but less so if you tax windfall profits and the wealthy. The windfall tax on energy company profits will go up from 25% to 35%, and there'll be a 45% windfall tax on electricity generators who've also been making big profits. He's also cutting the threshold above which you pay higher rate tax at 45p from 150,000 to 125,000. And he's committed to raise pensions and working age benefits by 10.1%. These are spending measures from next April. There'll also be more help with bills for benefit recipients and pensioners, and the energy price guarantee, crucially, will be extended by 12 months. But he's cut it back so the average bill could rise to £3,000 a year rather than £2,500. Now, there's not much about spending cuts there, and arguably the forecasts for economic growth are optimistic, but Jeremy Hunt's clearly hoping it will restore the government's fiscal credibility. And so far, Jane, since he stood up, there's been no big sell-off on the bond markets.
All right, Andy, thank you very much, Andy Verity. Well, with that news that Andy touched on, that millions of people will be paying more in income tax, and the Chancellor saying that the independent forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility, believes the UK is already in recession, our correspondent Phil Mackey has been speaking to people in Gloucester about what they made of this morning's announcement and what they mean for them.
It's been a day of financial reckoning here in Gloucester like everywhere else. At Mister's Cafe in the city centre, they want to take on new staff, but with energy costs and higher wages, it's not easy.
If utilities are going up, we've got less money to spend on wages. If the wages are going up, we've got even less money. we just don't know where we're going. You know, we're working 60, 70 hours a week to cover the bills that have gone up.
Businesses who are part of the city's improvement district met here earlier at a networking event. Chris has been struggling to get the right staff, so welcomed the pledge to support people getting into work.
It helps us bring on, young employees, young staff, and train them up and get them up to the level that we need for the business.
Charlie Watt's 24 and has just bought his first house with his partner. They've been hit by higher mortgages and will have to pay £300 a month more than they expected. He hopes the Chancellor's statement will calm the markets down.
In a few years' time, hopefully, it'll be smoothed out and everybody will be able to get a mortgage at a better rate. I think, obviously, I'm at a very lucky position to be able to look for a house right now, but I think for some people it's just extremely difficult, and it needs to work itself out so that other people can do what I'm trying to do now.
And it's not just individuals, it's small businesses too that will be heavily impacted. The message about keeping the recession, if there is one, to a minimum and tackling inflation will be very welcomed by some of these small shops here.
We increase the pace of consolidation.
Sandra Powell's worried about what ought to be a busy Christmas period, but doesn't think the promise to help small businesses goes far enough.
We don't expect much, but we'd like just a small amount for small businesses on High Street to have a little bit of help. And for me personally, I'd say I'd like to scrap business rates completely so we have a bit more competitive edge compared to online businesses.
Tackle the cost of living crisis and rebuild our economy.
It's not just short-term fixes that people want, but prosperity for future generations. Phil Mackey, BBC News, Gloucester.
Well, let's assess the impact of it all across the UK. In a moment, we'll hear from Thomas Morgan in Cardiff and Emma Vardy in Belfast. First, though, let's head to Glasgow and join our Scotland correspondent, Lorna Gordon. Lorna.
Yes, Jane, some of this will, some of this won't apply in Scotland. To touch on some of the big points, the rise in pensions and UK-wide benefits will apply here. But of course, the Scottish Parliament has some tax-raising powers. The tax bands are already different here in Scotland, so that means that the changes to the high rate of income tax won't apply here. The cap on increases and rent in the social sector won't apply here. That's because there's already a more comprehensive rent freeze in place here in Scotland. There will be a Barnett consequential of £1.5 billion to Scotland, but it will be up to the Scottish Government where that money is spent. Now, Jeremy Hunt described this as a recovery made in Britain. I think the tense exchanges at First Minister's questions this afternoon would point to the political fault lines on this. Nicola Sturgeon said that the Chancellor announced significant, deep, real-term cuts and tax rises, and that's why an increasing number of people in Scotland want the country to be independent. That's the situation in Scotland. Now to Thomas Morgan in Cardiff.
Well, of all the four nations, Wales has the highest level of poverty, and also according to the ONS, Wales receives the highest amount of state benefits as well, state supplements as well. So the news that pensions and benefits will rise in line with inflation will be in effect here in Wales, and I'm sure will be of some comfort here. But actually, preempting today's statement, the First Minister Mark Drakeford said he was more fearful than hopeful. And why did he say that? Well, he was referring to the public sector. He was urging Westminster to make sure the funding was still there, rising there. So the news that that will stay at the same rate for the next 2 years, I'm sure will be something the Welsh Labour government and Plaid Cymru, I'm sure, will be critical of. And as Lorna mentioned, there will be some more money coming to Wales. Wales does have some tax-raising powers. The majority of our money, though, does come from Westminster. It's 1.2 billion in additional funding coming to Wales. Over the next 2 years, though, the Welsh Labour government have already said that they're 1.5 billion down from last year. So there will be a black hole to fill for them somewhere. Now let's get the latest from Northern Ireland from Emma Vardy.
One of the big challenges facing Northern Ireland at the moment is that there is this big black hole in public finances. That's because departments at Stormont have overspent by some £660 million, partly due to energy costs going up, the cost of lots of things going up. And it's even harder to sort out here at the moment because there's no ministers in place to set a budget and take difficult decisions, because Northern Ireland at the moment doesn't have a functioning government. And what the Chancellor said today was that there was going to be an extra £650 million going to Northern Ireland in the money that it gets from central government. So that may go some way to relieve some of the pressure on civil servants here, but certainly doesn't solve the whole problem, because that 650 million will be spread out over the next couple of years. Another key takeaway for people in Northern Ireland was on heating oil, because many people here still use heating oil to heat their homes, and the cost of that has been going up considerably. There was going to be an extra £100 for people to help with the cost of heating oil. The Chancellor is doubling that to £200, and that's on top of the £400 that households are getting to help with energy bills in what is still going to be a very difficult winter.
Thanks so much. That's Emma Vardy, Thomas Morgan and Lorna Gordon. And you can, of course, find more details about the autumn statement and the cost of living crisis on our website. That is bbc.co.uk/news. The time is 1:20. Our top story this lunchtime. £55 billion of tax rises and spending cuts are announced in the autumn statement, but the Chancellor says he's asking more from those who have more.
And stay with us here on the BBC News Channel for continuing coverage and analysis from our team of correspondents in the UK and around the world.
More missile strikes have been reported across Ukraine, where officials say a gas production facility in Dnipro was among the infrastructure hit. Russia has targeted civilian energy facilities in recent weeks, and hundreds of thousands of people are living without power. Moscow hasn't commented on today's strikes. And in the recently liberated area of Kherson, the authorities say the bodies of more than 60 civilians have been found, showing signs of torture. Our correspondent James Waterhouse has been to Kherson, and you may find some of the details in his report distressing.
It's only once Russia leaves that you get a sense of what they've done. What allegedly happened here is a picture of brutality. This used to be a police station in Kherson. After Russian forces took control, officials say it became a torture chamber. Angela, a TV journalist, now in Kyiv, spent 31 days there.
On the third floor, people, men, were beaten. On the first floor, we heard that it was electrocution. When the person is being tortured with electricity, you hear it. It is a peculiar sound.
After hearing what Angela's been through, you get a really vivid glimpse of what this place must have been like. There is still the smell of burning in the air, but the silence is almost deafening, and each one of these rooms has its own story, and all of them will come out over time. She shared cell number 6 with 4 other women. What she didn't know was that her boyfriend was there too.
There were some people who were electrocuted. It was horrible. One guy was brought to the cell after interrogation. His tongue was black. It was so swollen, he couldn't put it back in his mouth.
In Kherson, daily life runs alongside grim discoveries. A mass grave was found here. Elsewhere in the city, the bodies of 63 civilians were also found. They all, say investigators, showed signs of being tortured. There were more than 3,000 crimes committed throughout occupation, the chief investigator tells us. 90% of them are war crimes, including rape, torture and murder. As the evidence mounts, so do Moscow's denials of targeting civilians. But when Russia retreats, it leaves a now familiar footprint. James Waterhouse, BBC News, Kherson.
A court in the Netherlands is due to deliver a verdict shortly on 4 men accused of bringing down a passenger plane over Ukraine in 2014, killing all 298 people on board. Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur when prosecutors say it was struck by a missile fired by Russian separatists. Our correspondent Anna Holligan sent this report.
This missile attack was one of the most notorious war crimes in Ukraine before allegations of atrocities there became an almost daily reality. The plane was shot out of the sky. Liam Sweeney from Newcastle was on board.
When you look at the world, there's always tragedies happen, but this one was part of me. It's part of my life, and it'll stay there forever. So.
And will this verdict change anything for you?
Move in the right direction, but I can't see it'll change a lot because obviously we're not going to get Liam back.
8 years on, today's verdict for the relatives at the epicentre of this disaster is the result of the biggest investigation in modern Dutch history. A reconstruction of the returned wreckage helped investigators to identify the exact warhead that perforated the plane and found it was fired from territory that was at the time held by Russian-backed separatist forces. Using intercepted telephone calls, eyewitnesses, photos and social media posts, they identified 3 Russians and 1 Ukrainian. The most prominent suspect is Igor Girkin, who prosecutors say is a former colonel in Russia's intelligence service, the FSB. They were all tried in absentia. Russia has always denied supplying the missile. Many of the victims' relatives believe if the world had reacted differently and taken a tougher stance against Moscow in response to the downing of flight MH17, the invasion of Ukraine and the geopolitical instability that has followed could have been avoided. Among them, Elzemik's father, Hans de Borst. He cherishes the memories of his only child and her documents recovered intact from the crash site.
It is extremely important to me. That feeling of justice to be done gives a good feeling and gives, I hope, some peace about this subject.
No one expected the 4 fugitives to face the judges, but the evidence presented during their trial has helped the families to find the truth. The families are packed into this courtroom now, listening to the judge reading out a verdict. They have waited more than 8 years for this moment, and the sentiment among many of them today is that their loved ones were among the first casualties of a conflict which is still raging today. Jane.
Anna, thank you. Anna Holligan there. Now we turn to sport, and England's men's cricketers who won the 2020 World Cup at the weekend have been thrashed by Australia in the first of 3 one-day internationals. An innings of 287, helped by a century from David Malan, wasn't enough to stop the hosts recording a 6-wicket victory. Our sports correspondent Andy Swiss was watching.
Just a few days ago, they were flying high, but for England, it was back down to earth with a bump.
Bog! A ripper from Stark.
A stunning start for Australia's bowlers, as England's T20 World Cup win seemed to have left something of a hangover. A clatter of early wickets, including captain Jos Buttler, and they were in deep trouble. So could they recover?
Goes big again.
Well, David Malan did his best, giving the crowd a bit of catching practice as he smashed a century. But if his batting was good, well, how about Australia's fielding? Ashton Agar stopping 1-6 in outrageous fashion as England were restricted to 287.
Oh, that's crazy. That is crazy.
It didn't look quite enough, and Australia soon proved it wasn't, as David Warner turned the run chase into more of a stroll. The hosts ultimately clinching it in style. Defeat for England then, but after that World Cup triumph, one that shouldn't hurt too much. Andy Swiss, BBC News.
Now, let's talk more about our main story here this lunchtime. Of course, it is all of the changes and measures announced by the Chancellor this morning. Let's just remind you of the key points. Anyone who earns £125,000 a year or more will pay 45p income tax. There's also a freeze in income tax thresholds, which means millions of people will start to pay more tax. However, pensions and benefits will rise from April, in line with September's inflation rate of 10.1%. For business, oil and gas companies will face a bigger windfall tax of 35%. That's up from 25%. That will start in the new year and run until March 2028. Spending on public services will rise more slowly than planned, except for health and education. And help for energy bills will be extended, but it'll be less generous. Let's get some closing thoughts from our economics correspondent, Andy Verity, who's still poring over all the details. So an hour or so after he sat down, what strikes you about these measures?
Well, most of the big changes we heard about already. We heard about it when Jeremy Hunt came into office and reversed most of the mini-budget cuts. And we also heard about it since the spring statement. So the government's putting £64 billion more into the economy, both through tax cuts and more spending, since March. But since we last heard from Jeremy Hunt, not much this year. In fact, the measures total only £1.2 billion, the tax and spending policy decisions, in terms of the money they'll take or put into the economy this year. But the big effect is 5 years from now. So that £55 billion we're talking about, £30 billion of spending cuts and £25 billion of tax rises, then those are chalked in for 5 years from now, which means, of course, that they might never happen.
All right, Andy, thank you very much for now. Andy Verity, our economics correspondent. That takes us to a look, of course, at the weather prospects. And Thomas Schaffenacker has joined me. Hi, Thomas.
Hello. Hi, Jane. We've got some wet weather around over the next few days. I mean, more of the same compared to what we've been having in the last few. But it's not like it everywhere. In fact, we've got some sunshine around today away from this weather system in southwestern parts of the UK. Let's zoom into this satellite picture, and you can see from Northern Ireland to southern parts of Wales and the south coast here, actually a little bit of sunshine. And then the rest of the country under the influence of this low pressure which arrived yesterday, and it's here to stay for the next few days. In fact, heavy rain across many parts of northern England, northern Wales too, and Scotland. Here the rain will be particularly heavy, especially around eastern parts of Scotland. That's prompted the Met Office to issue an amber warning, and in fact around Grampian, Cairngorm, generally the Aberdeenshire area, we could see around 100 to 150 millimetres of rain. Elsewhere, I think by tomorrow morning the rain will start to get a little bit lighter, but again a mixed bag generally, sort of the northern two-thirds of the country, whereas further south the weather should be pretty decent. A lot of bright weather around for places like Cardiff, Plymouth, London, even the Midlands enjoying some sunshine. But you can see in Scotland still very unsettled there, and it's still raining in eastern Scotland, but I don't think it'll be quite so heavy. And then Friday nights, if you're out, actually generally speaking, at least across Northern Ireland, Wales and England, a lot of dry weather, but a chance of some rain in Scotland. Now let's have a look at Saturday. We're sort of in between weather systems on Saturday. So on the one hand, this one fades away, but we have a fresh weather front pushed by a jet stream arriving in western parts of the British Isles. So this is what it looks like early in the morning and then into the afternoon. So this central swathe of the UK enjoying some fine weather. So let's call it from the Isle of Wight to Birmingham, Liverpool, Glasgow. Sunshine for you here. More cloudy on the North Sea coast, and then this rain eventually later in the afternoon will reach Belfast, and this weather front will sweep across the country during the course of Saturday night into Sunday. So many of us will get rain overnight, and then come Sunday, a rush of Atlantic winds, blustery really, particularly around western coasts, sunshine and showers, and pretty chilly. Not desperately cold, but compared to what we've been having lately, I think Sunday is going to feel on the nippy side. Back to you.
Thanks, Thomas. A few people wanted in on your weather forecast. That's
yeah, I noticed.
nice to be popular, isn't it? Thank you. Thomas Schaffenacker there with all the latest weather. And that is the BBC News at 1 for today. So goodbye from all of us on BBC One. We'll join our news teams wherever you are. Hope you have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.